Esta es una exposición remota y la organización ha trabajado con nuestro speaker justamente en la edición de su presentación. El expositor invitado es el señor Julien Perez de Francia. Él es vicepresidente de Estrategia y Política en la Iniciativa Climática de Aceite y Gas y forma parte de la Iniciativa Climática del Gas. Su participación es remota. Bienvenido, señor Pérez. Adelante con eso.
Join the H2 Latam Summit. I regret not to be a part physically with the team, but unfortunately some agenda schedule made it impossible for me to cross the Atlantic. The slides that we have are, addressing obviously the challenge and the role hydrogen could play in this economy, and most of the figures, I guess, are very well known by people inside the room, but I think it's always important for you to, and for the audience to understand what is the perspective, our perspective when it comes to the future of hydrogen and what are the scenarios that we're playing with. And then also looking at, where are the segments that a coalition of players like us could play to unlock some of the barriers that the hydrogen economy may face. So obviously we cannot do everything, and we don't want to repeat what our member companies are already doing well or what the market is already offering. So trying to identify the areas where such a coalition could play a significant role is very important to have an efficient use of resources and also of maximize our impact. So what is OGCI? So you've seen at the beginning of the slide, sorry that we come back just a couple of seconds, you can see at the bottom of the slides the composition of OGCI. So OGCI is a coalition of players. It's a non-for-profit organization that is bringing together 12 of the major oil and gas companies around the world, balancing between different geographies, as you can see, between Europe, US, Latin America, China, and the Middle East, but also providing a different perspective when it comes to international companies, so those who are listed on the general markets, and national companies, such as Aramco, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, or Petrobras in Brazil, or CNPC in China. So OGCI was launched in September 2014 at the UN Climate Summit by the CEO of Aramco at the time, Khaled Al-Faleh, as a coalition of players that aims to catalyze the change within the oil and gas industry and try to embark and leverage the skill sets of this industry to accelerate the low carbon transition. I think this is really the mantra of OGCI, is really to be a catalyst of change for the industry. So it's a coalition of players. As I say, there's two legs in the organization. The first leg is being the non-for-profit one, and the second one is an investment fund that I'm going to depict a little bit later. But if I focus first on the non-for-profit part of OGCI, so it's a CEO-led organization. So i.e. we bring together the CEO of the 12 member companies, I would say on a regular basis, let's say 3 to 4 times a year, to present them the strategic direction that we want to give to the organization and how we can meaningfully contribute and be additional to what each of the companies is already doing. Because the big value add, obviously, of a coalition like us is to focus our agenda on accelerating the segments of the low carbon economy that are very far behind the schedule, both in terms of deployment timing, and scale. But also focus our effort on areas that none of the companies individually would have the capacity to scale alone. And so we really focus the agenda on this additionality part is a very, very important part. And again, repeating what the market is doing or repeating what our member companies are already doing well would not bring any value added to the debate. And so this additionality is very, very important for us. And of course, being ambitious enough to really drive the change outside of the OGCI perimeter, but also embarking the rest of the industry. So if you look at the top right corner of my slides, those are the areas that we have defined to be of additionality for us. So carbon capture using storage, CCUS, is one of the areas that are again very far behind its deployment, where the oil and gas industry has a unique combination of skill sets, such as, for instance, just the knowledge of the subsurface, but also where none of the individual players would have the capacity and the breadth to accelerate it at pace and scale of what is required in any 1.5 or even below 2 degree scenarios. The other areas that we are focusing our agenda on is what we call the role of gas, which is actually dealing with the methane topic. So here again, and here I think the synergies that we have with our climate investment fund is very important, as you'll see a little bit later. But here again, the idea was for us to tackle the methane challenge, which has been, I would say for the 10, 20 years when I started my career in the climate and energy space, was not a topic of a real big focus. The focus was really on CO2, but methane actually is becoming more and more identified as a critical greenhouse gas to tackle very quickly if we want to have a meaningful impact on the climate change. And so this group is really dealing with those topics, such as also how to reduce the flaring issue, which is another areas where a coalition like us could benefit from the best practice sharing. And the last, well, not the last, but the third group that I think is interesting to highlight here is the transport, obviously, where we look at all the, particularly the hard to abate segment of the transport value chain. So namely the heavy duty vehicle, the marine transport and the aviation. We don't look necessarily at the light duty in very high detail, but more at all the segments that are, again, behind the schedule, behind the scale, behind the time to delivery. And where a coalition could play a role. And we have other group like on energy efficiency, well, it speaks by itself, the natural climate solution, which is to address the natural carbon sink, and again, how the remote location presence of our member companies could help to enhance the role of nature when it comes to carbon absorption. And what we have called the low emission opportunities group, which is more like our strategic thinking group and looking at all topics related to carbon value, carbon price, the scope 3, all the different energy scenarios, etc., etc. And so, as I said a few times, we have another leg in the organization, which is the Climate Investment Fund. So this is a fund that was launched in 2017, and it's a 1 billion plus fund. And the fund is actually running relatively independently from the member companies to have its own judgment and its own capacity of decision when it comes to take some investment decision. And it's taking equity share into startups that can enable, to some extent, the achievement of the goal that we have just depicted before. So, for instance, to give you an example on the methane, which I mentioned was a very good synergetic between the two legs. With the non-for-profit, we're going to, for instance, work with the member companies and push them to take actions and reduce and have their own target, for instance, a reduction emission target. And to reach the targets, obviously they can use the technology that, if they wish to, OGCI climate investment would have invested in, such as, for instance, satellites or drones or optimized valve, if I may. So today, OGCI Climate Investment have nearly 30 investments in its portfolio. So again, focusing on methane, CCUS, and CO2 efficiency in use. And this year, the climate investment team has released an impact report quantifying the contribution of climate investment to the climate action, which is worth reading because it's not always that easy to estimate this kind of impact. But the group has worked very, very carefully with a number of players to make the methodology as robust as possible. So if I move on to the next slide, where I'm going to depict very quickly the key milestones. So I mentioned some of them: the launch of OGCI, obviously, the launch of climate investment, and a number of CEO steerco. We've been progressively as well joined by companies. We did not start by 12. We started with a smaller number of companies, and progressively some others joined. And in particular, in the course of 2018, Chevron, Exxon, and OGCI joined right after Petrobras joined us as well. In terms of announcements, we've progressively, we have relatively quickly actually focused our agenda on trying to identify areas where, again, as a coalition, we can have a meaningful contribution. That was, for instance, the definition of targets, which is not necessarily an easy task to do because each of the companies were accounting, for instance, the methane emission with slightly different methodologies. The devil is in the detail in this case. So there is a work to align on the calculation methodology before being able to design a target, and then having this target sufficiently ambitious, to stretch the action agenda of the member companies. So we started with methane. We extended that then to the carbon intensity, and also now we have launched very recently what is called the Aiming for Zero Methane Emission initiative, which is, and I'm going to come on that later on, but it's really a mindset change. And I think that's one of the most important announcements that we've made in the last few months. Is it's really to invite and to incentivize the oil and gas industry to replicate the best practice they have been able to implement when they made this change in mindset when it came to safety, for instance. All this industry has a zero fatality goal, each of the companies playing in this industry. And we know that how best practices and the gold standard level that this industry managed to reach when it came to safety that inspire other industry afterwards. The same happened for oil spills. I mean, there's no company in the world, I believe, that have an objective that's different to zero when it comes to oil spills. And it's really this mindset change that we would like to inject now when it comes to methane and say, okay, from now on, we aim for zero methane emission. Maybe we're not going to reach it. Some, methane emission can happen because we can't mitigate them or for some other reasons. But the mindset should be let's get to zero and let's put all the means of actions to reach that goal. In addition to that, I focus quite a lot on methane, but we're also very, very active on all the other aspects. And on the CCUS, for instance, so we did quite an extensive work scanning 52 countries, mainly in the developing part of the world, to identify where the source points of emission, the potential storage areas, and also the potential transport route to transport the CO2 emission. And so what are the hubs that can be decarbonized thanks to CCUS going forward? So OGCI is also about partnership. As I mentioned before, our intention is not to work in isolation. We want to have an influence on the rest of the industry, and we leverage as well on our partnership to do that. So we have a number of partnerships with different type of institutions such as the United Nations or the World Bank. We also work a lot with universities as well as other coalition of players such as the Methane Guiding Principle, for instance, which is a coalition of private and non-for-profit and countries as well players. We work a lot with the Clean Energy Ministerial on the CCUS or with also some value chain players such as Tenabulk, for instance, when it came to mobile carbon capture in the shipping industry. So as I mentioned before, we have started our journey in 2014 with a number of series of actions. We've tried to structure them as well with a refreshed strategy that we launched a little bit earlier, actually 1 year ago, where we tried to structure our value proposition to the markets around three main pillars, which are regrouping some of the targets, but also trying to focus our agenda on where we can be additional. So we get all the companies, for instance, to sign to an objective of net zero operation and to leverage their influence in the non-operated assets. So that means that all the OGCI member company CEOs have signed up to a target that basically say that they're going to reach net zero operation, so on their operated domain, and try to do the same on their equity domain. That has a big impact. We estimate it to be 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year. For some companies, they had already this kind of announcement that were made, at least for the operated domain. I think none of them had something related to the equity domain, but for the operated domain, some of the companies had it, particularly the European companies. But for some companies, it was new. And I think the fact that we managed to get the leverage on the equity perimeter is quite a big stretch for those members, but also invite other companies outside of OGCI member companies to sign up to this similar type of objectives, because those are business partners of our member companies. The other pillar, obviously, is to lead the entire oil and gas industry, and so we work quite actively with other players, and we engage them. The initiative that I mentioned before, the Aiming for Zero Methane Emission, which try to make this mindset change towards zero tolerance on methane, is one example for us to outreach to the rest of the industry. So again, without saying too much, because I know that I'm going to say a little bit more later on this, because it's an important part of reducing the footprint of the hydrogen value chains to reduce the methane when it comes to, for instance, the production of blue hydrogen. But just to give you an example, we launched it in March with the 12 CEOs of OGCI member companies. Now we have 55 CEOs that have signed up to it. So it's a way for us to engage the rest of the industry, to understand where they come from, how they address the methane challenge, share and learn as well some best practices, but also create this momentum basically and change this mindset. And the last bit is about acting to help the society to get decarbonized, because when it comes to energy, we know that it's a demand-driven market, and so it's very important for us to engage with the society as well, for them to switch from fossil to non-fossil use of energy, being electricity from renewable energy sources, for instance. So trying to incentivize them to make this evolution to non-fossil energy. So as we can prepare as well the wind down of production progressively. And because one should not force into reducing the production while the demand has not changed, because that would just create an energy crunch and disruption that would prevent the world to move and to make its transition, basically. So it wouldn't make sense. So that's why working with the society to be able to make the demand evolving as we make the production evolving. And here we focus mainly on two aspects, one being the CCUS, which has been historically a very key part of OGCI. So we identify, for instance, as I mentioned before, the hubs around the world that could be decarbonized thanks to CCUS. So I'm going to come on that later on as well. But the idea is not to have one CCUS project per source of emission, but more to regroup the source of emission in sufficiently large volume to justify the existence of a CCUS project of a very large scale. That's the case of Northern Light, for instance, which is a very big project in the North Sea that OGCI has supported. And that is basically capturing the CO2 emission from coastal area around the North Sea, transporting by boat, and then this is injected into a subsurface depleted oil field of Norway. And so the volume of the project is sufficiently big to make the cost very attractive for a number of CO2 emitters, and particularly for those CO2 emitters that don't have that much alternatives to date. So for instance, take the cement industry. The chemical reaction to transform the chalk into cement is emitting CO2 emission, whatever is the source of energy. It doesn't change. It's a chemical reaction. The steel industry has also a similar type of issue when it comes to CO2 emission, or some of the fertilizer as well processes have the same issue. And so when you plug those industry into a wider range of industrial areas, for other players who can have alternatives, may also choose to pick up the CCUS option because it's the most economics. And I think this is what we want to achieve at the end of the day, is to say it's not CCUS or renewable. Actually, our member companies are doing both and pushing both full speed, because we do believe that depending on the case and the location, it could be one or the other, but it's not. It does not. It's one solution is not preventing the other to happen. Actually, I would even say that the CCUS industry, to some extent, reinforce the penetration rate of renewable, for instance, by decarbonizing some source of electricity that are still needed to stabilize the grid, for instance, through gas or coal. And so it's a very important pillar for us to decarbonize the society. The other aspect is hydrogen, and this is really the key topic that I want to deep dive on. And I'm sorry, the introduction was very long, but I think it's important for you to capture what is the essence of OGCI and where we try to achieve, and also because the hydrogen economy has so much interconnection with a number of other segments of the energy transition. It's important to put the things into context. So when it comes to hydrogen, so of course, I'm sure that most of you know that, but just to depict a little bit the situation. So of course, you know that hydrocarbon today provide roughly 80% of our energy needs. It has been roughly the case since the last 2 decades. It doesn't change. I mean, the renewable energy penetration, which is very important and on every year more and more important, which is great, is still just adding up. And so we're not saying yet an energy transition, we're more saying like an energy addition to date. So i.e. the renewable energy is just coming on top of an increasing need for hydrocarbon. Of course, this needs to be changed between now and 2050, sorry, and even 2040, but also more importantly, 2050, if we want to reach a below 2 degree or 1.5 degree scenario. So there's various scenarios that are being developed by the International Energy Agency. I will not go into the details of it. The first one being the stated policy scenario steps, which is basically providing a future with the existing policy in place. So what is highlighted here is that in the current policy scenario, there's still quite a lot of non-change, let's say. There's still quite a lot of stability in the current grid, particularly for when it comes to electricity production from coal. Even if it's slowed down a little bit, it's only slow by 20%, and which is insufficient, obviously, to reach a 2-degree scenario. If you look at announced pledge scenario, which is the APS, so the second scenario, in the second scenario, there's quite a number of announcements that were made in the past COP that are achieved, but still, it's not enough to reach a 2-degree scenario. We know that in the APS, we're probably going to land into something between 2 and 3 degrees, while the objective is well below 2 and, if possible, 1.5. If you look at the SDS scenario, so here is the Sustainable Development Scenario, and it represents a gateway to the outcome targeted by the Paris Agreement. And without assuming any net negative emission, this scenario is consistent with limiting the global temperature rise to 1.65 with a 50% probability. And so with some level of net negative emission after 2070, temperature rise could be reduced to 1.5 in 2100. So the Sustainable Development Scenario, or SDS, also integrates the stimulus package required for global sustainable recovery from COVID-2019. The SDS scenario starts to be like one of the very, very credible scenario if we want the world to respect the Paris Agreement. Now you have an even more stringent scenario that was announced, which is the net zero emission by 2050 scenario, which set out a narrow but achievable pathway for the global energy sector to achieve net zero CO2 emission by 2050. It does not rely on emission reduction from outside the energy sector to achieve its goal. For this scenario, there is a number of measures that need to be put in place. I think the few hundred measures that were proposed by the IEA in their scenario, with 80% or so associated with the energy demand. So there is a very strong need to drive down the energy demand to be much more efficient in the way we consume energy, and then the rest on the energy production. But both set of actions have to go hands in hands. You cannot just act on the production and hoping that the demand will magically transform. No, you can just act on the demand and just hoping that the people will respect energy reduction if the energy become very abundant and so very cheap. So the two things have to come hand in hand. But in both cases, in both the SDS and in the NZD, it requires a very high decrease in fossil fuel use, and particularly for unabated coal and gas, which is a significant change in the energy transition. The key decarbonization levers are quite important depending on the sector that you're looking at. So currently, as I was saying, with let's say the announced pledge, we are heading toward the temperature which is around 3 degrees rise based on the current and the potential announced policy. We need to have between 68 and 84 degrees in emission relative to business as usual pledge and targets to decrease the temperature rise to consistent with the 2-degree scenario. And of course, this requires massive acceleration in ambition within the next decade. So when you look at the different sectors that would be concerned, just by the transport sector, for instance, the reduction that is required between a 2-degree and a 1.5 degree versus the business as usual is between 55 and 80% of emission reduction. In some regions, that may happen because, for instance, we know that in Europe, a very strict policy has been put in place when it comes to internal combustion engines. So potentially the transport will meet those reduction efforts. But we have to think globally. I mean, greenhouse gas has no frontier, and it wouldn't make sense to make very strong and dramatic effort in some specific region at a very high marginal cost, while in some other regions, the similar type of effort cannot be achieved because of a lack of financing or lack of infrastructure. So it's very important to keep that in mind. The same happened for the industry, of course, for the oil and gas and for the power sector. If I move on to the projection, and if you look at the different contribution of solution when it comes to the decarbonization, so what we know is that actually approximately 10 gigatons will come from the expansion of hydrogen and CCUS, and this is 20% of the reduction effort to meet the Paris Agreement to meet the Paris Agreement goal. This is huge. And obviously, again, here it comes hand in hand because, as I mentioned before, when you create a CCUS hub, then you allow a low carbon production of hydrogen to happen. So it makes a lot of sense as well to expand both in a coordinated manner. So when it comes to hydrogen, again, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it, but according to some studies that were performed notably by McKinsey, up to 80%, 18% of the final energy demand in 2050 will be covered by hydrogen. And so hydrogen can play a major role in supporting a 1.5 or 2 degree pathway by allowing a number of things. The first thing is to enable large-scale renewable energy integration and power generation, because hydrogen could play the role of storing electricity into the form of hydrogen and reinject it in the gas system, for instance, and so reproduce electricity when it's needed. The other aspect is to distribute energy across sector and region, because hydrogen could be locally produced and so locally distributed as well, and so be a much more, let's say, equilibrated distribution of energy than what we can see today, for instance, with the fossil fuel industry. The third aspect is also to act as a buffer to increase energy system resilience with an abatement potential of 0.4 gigaton. Again, because the capacity of hydrogen to store electricity when it comes to a peak production, for instance, or low demand, and then to redistribute it when there is a peak of demand, is allow to not waste the energy, and so has this capacity. It also, and very importantly for us at least, from our point of view, it allows to decarbonize transport with pure hydrogen, synthetic fuel, and ammonia, showing a potential of decarbonization of 3.2 gigaton of CO2 emission, which is huge, obviously. The total CO2 emission from the world is ranging between 50 and 60 gigaton of CO2 equivalent. 3.2 is a significant contribution, obviously. And one of the other aspects, so decarbonizing the transport is a very important aspect, decarbonizing the industrial energy through the use of hydrogen as an alternative energy carrier with an abatement potential here of 1.2 gigatons. So the same logic that apply for the transport apply as well for the energy sector. Provide as well clean feedstock for the industry and provide, enable, let's say, the expansion of the different color of hydrogen. So I'm going to focus on the green and the blue, but of course you have, also the capacity to produce hydrogen from other sources. So the way that we see as well, like the energy system when it comes to hydrogen is we're reusing here something that has been created by Europe, but we also use it as our own perspective because we do believe that it's a very accurate presentation. The potential for hydrogen in the widespread transform of the energy system is quite important. So hydrogen obviously can be used for interseasonal and short-term storage, power generation and peaking station, industrial use, domestic use such as heating, cooking, and power, transportation use as a fuel, as I mentioned before. But our hydrogen can also be something that can be exported, which could be also a source of revenue for some regions and countries. And the hydrogen is a very important aspect for us because, as I said before, we have this strategy that OGCI set up with 3 pillars. The last pillar is about decarbonizing society. If you recall correctly, there was 2 mentioned. One was CCUS and the other one being hydrogen. And so for us, it's a very, very important aspect. And we try to address those different segments that you can see on the screen right now to either produce low carbon hydrogen or to stress on the demand of hydrogen, and notably when it comes to the transport, which is one of the key areas that we want to look at. And so either at GCI, we try to demonstrate that there is a possibility here, but we also demonstrate that there is a possibility to produce hydrogen using CCUS in particular. So the hydrogen market today, again, I'm not going to spend too much time. I know that it's very well known by the audience, but roughly we produce a little bit less than 100 million tons of hydrogen. And this is highly predominantly gray today, with a big dominance from coal and natural gas and as a byproduct. Tomorrow, it would have to be much greener. Like this picture cannot stay like this if we want the hydrogen to play a meaningful role in the low carbon transition. It's impossible to continue to produce hydrogen using gray, considering that this 90 million tons of hydrogen, in 2020 is going to expand quite dramatically in the years to come. And the hydrogen is used for different, produced, from different sources, but is also used for different usage, such as in the chemical industry, in the refining, and almost nothing is used by the transport. So again, this picture should change quite dramatically in the years to come, at least from our perspective, if hydrogen intends to play a meaningful role in the transition. So we need a massive scale up of hydrogen production to meet the potential for the decarbonization. And total mature and announced cumulative capacity leads to roughly 18 million tons per year of blue and green hydrogen by 2030. Blue hydrogen sources tend to have higher maturity level today, but combined green energy capacity is expected to exceed blue hydrogen capacity later in the decade. So from the viewpoint of OGCI, the blue hydrogen is a good, let's say, ramp-up period to enable a hydrogen economy to happen. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there is a high chance that the cost of green hydrogen become much more competitive than the blue hydrogen, and so displace progressively the blue hydrogen as we move to a greener source of hydrogen. However, what we know as well is that we need 1,200 million tons per year by 2050. So we are very, very far behind. This is more than 60 times the increase in 20 years between 2030 and 2050. So there is lots of new hydrogen projects announced to meet this new expected demand soon. But we know that the step is huge, and so there is really need to all hands to be put on the table. And so although lots of projects have been announced, we know that it's going to be a very, very hard time. So for instance, we run calculation based on IEA, hydrogen, BNF, and other database for 2021 to check total amount of planned capacity for hydrogen project relative to expected demand. And actually our calculation show a very big gap, of course, between the expected total demand for hydrogen and announced production today. The total mature, again, and announced cumulative capacity lead to 18 million, as I said before, by 2030. This is sufficient if only the transportation sector, i.e. the light-duty vehicle, the heavy-duty vehicle, the marine and aviation, is considered. There is a significant gap for the total demand. And so there is a very big need for large investment to meet the future expectation for clean hydrogen. And of course, large investment means that there is a need for very strong policy support to enable those large investment to happen. So the capital and cost allocation for green hydrogen, I will not spend too much time on that. I'm sure that's going to be covered by other speakers, but the green hydrogen is produced, as you say, using renewable energy or low carbon electricity. There are huge capital implications for investment in green hydrogen. The electrolyzer capacity is more than 10 times current capacity by 2050, and this is so a 23% annual growth rate between 2030 and 2050. That's a huge, there is a huge need for investment here. And today, at least, the green hydrogen production costs between 3 and 8 kilograms in 2020. Of course, this is much higher than the gray hydrogen. This is also much higher than the blue hydrogen. And the main cost driver for green hydrogen are renewable electricity cost, especially if there is grid competition for the same renewable energy sources, the electrolyzer capital expense, and the load factor. And so while these costs are expected to decline in the future, for instance, hydrogen costs may fall by 30%, let's say, by 2030 and 66% by 2050, according to BNF and the Hydrogen Council. Expect a 60% fall cost between 2020 and 2030, so a little bit more ambitious, mainly for the offshore wind-based electrolysis. This highlights the needs for blue hydrogen in the transition, because if blue hydrogen does not come up and cope with the increase that is required for the production of hydrogen to enable to have a meaningful demand at the same time, the green hydrogen will never happen because the infrastructure will not be there in place. So it's very, very important for that to happen. So if I move on to the next slide and focusing on the blue hydrogen, the importance of CCUS. So here again, this is one of our key beliefs, is that the blue hydrogen is produced again from natural gas using CCUS. So it's methane reformer as the gray, but actually you capture the CO2 at the outlet of the unit and you inject it on the ground. And so what we do as a OGCI, and again, it's part of our strategy, is to identify the hubs that could welcome hydrogen production and push those hubs to happen. So through working with the local stakeholder who could be really interested to invest into the unit, the CCUS unit, but also with policymaker. And so blue hydrogen is important to the transition, especially in region with access to low-cost fossil fuel reserve, CO2 storage facility and existing pipeline. For instance, the cost of gas with CCUS is about 10 to 20% higher than gas without CCUS. And a market for hydrogen can be developed based on blue hydrogen with the intent to transition from gray hydrogen and pave the way to green hydrogen. So again, it's not blue or green. It's a transition path from blue to green, from gray to blue to green. That's exactly what is expected in many regions, and this is why we're pushing this agenda. So scaling blue hydrogen at a competitive cost is enhanced by harnessing the concept of CCUS hub, as I mentioned before. So you merge multiple sources of CO2 emission geographically close to each other to mutualize the cost of transport and storage of CO2. So this is an active area within OGCI. It's this, and I'm going to discuss that later on. But for instance, BP has a 1 gigaton blue hydrogen facility at Teesside with 2 million tons per year of CO2 capture. So ultimately, according to the Hydrogen Council, the shifting geopolitical reality, so the surge in gas price to Russia invasion of Ukraine, means that there is no value in debating whether blue or green hydrogen is better. Both solutions are needed urgently to mitigate the climate change. And as such, OGCI is interested in clean hydrogen. No matter its production method, we want to push the hydrogen, the low carbon hydrogen, but we do believe that blue hydrogen has a very meaningful role to play to scale up this market. So how do we support the hydrogen market? So the first thing is to address the methane emission, because if you produce hydrogen coming from natural gas, what you want is to master the methane emission coming up from natural gas value chain to make sure that when the natural gas enter into the methane reforming units, then at least this portion of the emission has been mastered. If you take the methane leakage from the oil and gas industry, this is 2 gigatons of CO2 emission equivalent. So this is a huge challenge. So we address the methane issue, the methane leaks that can happen. Then there is also the CCUS, as I mentioned, to enable the blue hydrogen to happen and to create an economy associated with it. So we identified the CCUS hub that could welcome hydrogen units. And then there is the transportation workstream to investigate the possibility of using hydrogen as a transport fuel. Of course, in addition to that, our member companies individually invest into green and blue hydrogen and in renewable energy capacity to enable to take over and to take up what the action that we are trying to kickstart and to catalyze to the next level. So on the methane intensity, we launched, as I mentioned before, an intensity target in 2020, which was well below 0.2%. This has been refreshed quite a number of times, and this has become a standard, a best practice standard for the rest of the industry. This comes with two challenges for the OGCI and for the rest of the industry, which is addressing the reduction, but also addressing how to quantify the emissions. So even if OGCI companies today are well ahead of industry when it comes to methane emission, it's not enough. And we have definitely to come to something that is closer to zero. And when it comes to the quantification, the use of OGCI climate investment capacity into some technologies that where GGSAT, for instance, or other solutions that enable to better quantify the methane emission, give to our member companies the confidence that now they have all the tools to quantify in a much more accurate manner the methane emission. And so we need to scale that up, and this is one of the efforts that we're trying to achieve. So, as I mentioned before, we have this target. So we started from a point of 0.3% on methane in 2017, and then we reduced it progressively because when we announced the target, it was in 2018 at 0.2. We were at 0.25 at that moment, but that has driven down the emissions. I know that for 2021, we are just finalizing the data, but we are very, very close to 0.17, if I'm not mistaken. So we are in the red, in the ballpark of what we have said, of well below 0.2. We announced as well the aiming for zero methane emission, as I mentioned before. I'm going to come back very quickly on it, but this is another way for us to drive down and to incentivize action. One other action that we've made is to deploy satellite campaign to mitigate methane emission in developing countries. So this has allows for practical support to methane emission reduction. It was one of the flagship activity of OGCI for 2021 and 2022 because it includes monitoring of oil and gas assets for several countries. So we started with Iraq. We are now deploying it in Kazakhstan and Algeria. And when a methane plume was detected from the satellite, we shared it as quickly as possible with the local operator so they can take mitigation action and act and stop the methane emission. And it has received like a very, very positive results with a lot of methane emission avoided. And that allowed to secure a much more robust natural gas value chain as long as the world will require oil and gas. Another example, as I said, so it was the aiming for zero. So you have the picture of some of the CEOs that were present at that meeting when we launched it. Again, I'm not going to depict that into too much detail. I spent quite a lot of time already on it, but it's really this mindset change and try to, move the world toward a zero methane ambition. Then when it comes to data, of course, there is also a need to increase transparency and data accuracy. So we work with the European Commission and the GMP to improve our reporting framework. We also collaborate with the wider climate community to help science progress on methane. For instance, as I mentioned before, we have some partnership with university like the Imperial College, World Bank, Stanford, EDF, to help them on quantifying effectively the methane emission. I'm not going to depict that into very high detail, but to give you an example, we work with Environmental Defense Fund, so EDF, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition under the patronage of the European Union. And here we finance and provide site access for methane measurement and develop independent scientific paper. We have a partnership with Stanford to establish the methane budget, or with the World Bank and the Penn Institute under the Global Gas Flaring Explorer, where OGCI is providing technical data and financial support to calibrate the data acquisition and modeling from satellite on flaring radiation converted to quantity. And so all of this, of course, will come into the public domain. And we have some partnership, as I mentioned before as well, with the United Nations, for instance, and the Global Methane Alliance, or other partners. Now, if I move on the CCUS parts, so as I said, we look at the methane leakage, we look as well at the CCUS. As I said before, we launched with BCG what we have called the Global CCUS Hub Search Tool, which is something that anyone could look on the internet. It has identified actually, so using different type of information to identify some areas where are the location of CO2 emission, where are the storage capacity underground. So here we were leveraging obviously on the capacity of our member companies and their knowledge, and where are the transport route, and what is the rough economics of a different optimized hub when you try to regroup the CO2 source all together. And so we launched this work across 56 countries. We identified 279 hubs. Some of them came at a cost that is well below $100, and even at a cost that was $50. So now we have identified them. We are trying to mature some of those hubs in a number of countries and make some deep dive and assessment of whether or not we are on the right pathway. So we work with the Clean Energy Ministerial on this topic. We have a joint collaboration agreement. We have also a CO2 storage resource catalog where we try to identify where are the potential storage capacity and some qualifier around those storage capacity and how we can characterize them. And also a program that was called OGCI Kickstarter, which aimed to reference as a game-changing CCUS technology enabler. It was referenced like this by the Asian Development Bank. So those activities, of course, help us to try to make the case and identify the business opportunities for CCUS. And now we are making some beyond those global studies, also some deep dive in some specific geographies such as Egypt, Brazil, India, and Asia Pacific. I'm going to share with you some results about Brazil right now, or Latin America, sorry, right now. So what are our key CCUS findings? The first thing is that in all the different countries that you can see on the map, some hubs came at a very interesting economic profile. So in Mexico, for instance, 5 hubs were identified. We consider that the environment for CCUS in Mexico is relatively less mature with limited CCUS activity in the economy. There was previous CCUS commitment. However, the rate it required to be much more reinforced to have the enabling policy environment for CCUS infrastructure to happen. The abatement costs for most of the country cluster are relatively moderate and sometimes high, but by focusing on high purity emission from natural gas processing, for instance, the Villahermosa cluster become very highly attractive candidate for CCUS development. So we are making a deep dive specifically on Mexico right now as we speak. The same is happening in Brazil, where 5 hubs were identified. We consider here that the CCUS environment is relatively favorable despite limited governmental support. And notably, it's the case because of the very large, of course, storage location that exists in the Santos Basin. 2 hubs were identified to be below $100 per ton. very close to Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And again, we are making a deep dive to confirm that. And in Trinidad and Tobago, only one cluster was identified, but it's covering most of the main industrial island of Trinidad, with a potential abatement at highly competitive cost, given the highland high purity emission. There is a lot of ammonia production, for instance, that provide a very, very good quality of CO2 emission. However, there is limited regulation. And so while we believe that CCUS would offer a very low cost abatement, it could quite easily be expanded to cover most of the island emission once the infrastructure is in place, we can see that there is, for the moment, a relatively limited policy mechanism in place to support that. So among those three countries, we have identified again 6 hubs below $100 per ton, accounting for roughly 200 million tons of CO2 of annual emissions on full scale, so the entire hub. And actually, if we want to optimize it, it's something like around 50 million tons of CO2 per year. So you can see all of that in our website. There is a number of other activity where we work on the Article 6, for instance, to enable the use of carbon storage units to drive some economics around CCUS. We also work on policy mechanism to support the large-scale deployment of carbon capture and storage. And we also work on some CCUS white paper and, again, as I mentioned before, the CO2 storage catalog. We were thinking that, for instance, we could do something similar on from the CCUS and moving to the hydrogen and looking at hydrogen hub. That's one of the ideas that we are exploring. Not sure that we're going to make it, but at least this is something that we are working on. So we do see hydrogen as a solution to decarbonize transportation. As I mentioned before, it's low carbon fuel, either because through the drop-in fuel compatible with existing vehicle, through synthetic fuel blended component from capture CO2 or in green and blue hydrogen, or using biofuels. So the low carbon fuel segment has hydrogen into it. And if you look at the hydrogen specifically, we do believe that there is a case study when it comes to the use of hydrogen as a fuel for transportation, particularly when it comes to the heavy duty vehicle as well as for the marine transport. So if you look at the transport, the combined hydrogen transport demand stems primarily from synthetic fuel, and notably for the synthetic aviation fuel and the ammonium. So and the transport is facing a huge challenge for decarbonization. So the hydrogen presents a lot of opportunity. It's estimated that there is an estimated total of 180 million tons of hydrogen demand per year by 2050, and most demand stems primarily for synthetic fuel, for instance, the synthetic aviation fuel or ammonia, for, of course, aviation and marine, respectively. And the direct use of hydrogen is mostly driven by the road transport, in particular for the heavy-duty truck market. Although the production capacity of hydrogen is projected to lag behind total demand for hydrogen, if only the transport sector is considered, there is more than enough capacity to meet the need for marine, aviation, and road transport. So we suggest that there is more opportunity for hydrogen in the transport need to be unlocked, and this is an active area for OGCI going forward. So, for instance, we have identified practical application of hydrogen to foster the growth of the market. We have looked at hydrogen as a transportation fuel for heavy-duty vehicles to provide a path for decarbonization of the transport sector. Heavy-duty road transport is a difficult one, of course, to decarbonize alongside marine and aviation. And electrification may not be suitable option for all applications. So here, hydrogen offers several benefits in this transport subsector. So hydrogen technology maintained strong momentum in 2019, awakening keen interest among policymakers. It was a record year for electrolysis capacity becoming operational, and several significant announcements were made for the upcoming years. But the fuel cell electric vehicle market almost doubled owing to outstanding expansion in China, in Japan, and in Korea. And so we've seen like a number of projects in those countries, but also in other countries, like in Canada, for instance, where we know that there is a 20 megawatt, for instance, project that is under construction. So OGCI can only work in the pre-commercial space, and so is limited by competition law. Because of this, OGCI is not interested in the production of hydrogen by itself, but because some of our member companies are already competing in the area, but we are very interested in the hydrogen distribution technology. So as I mentioned before, we enable CCUS for hydrogen to come and to plug in, but this is going to be an investment from our member companies. For the distribution part, we can definitely directly, be interested into some of those projects. And so as such, for instance, OGCI has conducted studies into the large-scale distribution of hydrogen from production site to retail station as a means to facilitate the use of hydrogen as a fuel for heavy-duty truck. investigating distribution network within OGCI scope. So what we identified as accelerator option for hydrogen distribution study is that we identified that hydrogen distribution via pipeline is the most cost-effective solution for large-scale demand, particularly when it's used a retrofitted LNG pipeline, which is some of them we had like very robust data because it's part of the OGCI company scope. We also investigated other oil distribution options such as compressed hydrogen, liquefied hydrogen, ammonia, or liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And the demonstration to accelerate adoption of hydrogen as a fuel could be very much explored. And this is really something that we invite the world to consider. Eventually, OGCI would be willing to do that, but that's something that I think is very important to further explore. And so OGCI hopes to explore participation in projects to demonstrate commercial viability of hydrogen by addressing one or more barriers to scalable, reliable, and economical fueling infrastructure for the road transport. So with that, I'm sorry, I'm going to be, I've been a little bit long, but I hope that you understand where the angle that we try to work on. We definitely welcome any partnership going forward and any, suggestion where we can try to complement each other, particularly when it comes to, again, the CCUS part, the methane part, or the distribution part, as you understand, were our key focus area. And so I definitely invite you to look into more details. You have some further details on our website. Thank you very much. I just want to thank again the organizer for inviting us. It was a pleasure for the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative to be with you. And I wish you a very, very pleasant conference.
Muchísimas gracias al señor Pérez, que ha tocado temas relevantes para introducirnos justamente en la conferencia. Nuestro deseo de que, sigan encontrando a través de su empresa o implementando más centros para la producción de hidrógeno verde.